Another important aspect of species life history strategy is the life cycle that it undergoes, which basically here we're talking about the type of reproduction. So some species reproduce asexually, some reproduce sexually, and some reproduce both asexually and sexually. Okay, so in asexual reproduction, you have a self that pretty much just makes a genetic copy of itself, cell division through mitosis. And this has advantages of being able to grow really fast, like this little hydra here that can bud off individuals through mitotic divisions. Sexual reproduction involves two parents and a single offspring. They have to undergo meiosis and fertilization. And this has the advantage that you can have genetic recombination, okay, so that you can have different kinds of genotypes amongst your offspring, but it can have a disadvantage of introducing deleterious genes. So if you mate with somebody that happens to have bad genes, your offspring may pick up some of those bad genes, okay? And we're going to see some other pros and cons of asexual and sexual reproduction in a minute here. But let's take a look at this typical life cycle, because we think of humans as an easy way of thinking about life cycle, and humans as an example of an animal. And most animals follow this kind of life cycle, although there's many exceptions, okay, where you have a female and a male. Females produce eggs, males produce sperm. Fertilization happens, that develops into a diploid zygote, right? So gametes are haploid. Remember, they have half the amount of genetic material. These come together in fertilization, right? So now we have a diploid zygote, which develops through mitotic divisions into a diploid juvenile that eventually grows into an adult. Again, some species, like this soft coral here, utilize both asexual and sexual reproduction. In this diagram, you can see that this coral here is using the asexual budding process, okay, to produce more and more polyps so the colony can grow, and even pieces of a colony can grow off and bud off more and more polyps. And so that's a form of reproduction, asexual reproduction. But at other times, the corals can actually undergo meiotic divisions to produce gametes, and then when they spawn, they expel eggs or sperm into the water and, find the gamete of the opposite gender, so the sperm and eggs can find each other out in the water column. And then this process of fertilization will lead to the production of a zygote, develops into a larvae that swims around, eventually settles on the bottom to form a polyp that can grow into a new coral colony. So there's actually been a lot of discussion and debate and controversy over why reproduce sexually anyway, because there seem to be both benefits and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. Why not just reproduce asexually? It seems to be so much more efficient. And in fact, if you reproduce sexually, one of the disadvantages that an individual transmits only half of its genome to the next generation, right? And from an evolutionary perspective, the idea is to get more and more of your genes into the next generation. Of course, not consciously, but that's what ends up benefiting an individual, okay? And then, but when you reproduce sexually, the population growth rate is going to be slower, okay? And that the long-held argument of then why reproduce sexually if you're going to lose half your genome and grow slower, is that sexual reproduction, because recombination happens during meiosis to produce a variety of different kinds of gametes, which will then come together with gametes of a second individual, that this promotes genetic variation. Okay, and now you have a larger variety of offspring that are produced, that are out there in the world, okay? And so you have these different genetic variants that you may at least have some individuals that will be able to respond if the environment changes or different kinds of environmental challenges. It's kind of like buying 100 different sort of lottery tickets, and that if you wanted to win the lottery, and you had enough money to buy 100 tickets, would you buy 100 tickets all with the same number? Or would you buy 100 tickets that have 100 different numbers to increase your chances that at least one of them is going to be the winner? Okay, so that's kind of the same idea, that you increase the ability for at least some of those genotypes to be able to respond to the environmental challenges, survive, and be able to reproduce within that environment. So let's take a look at the cost of sex, because those benefits of recombination must really have to outweigh some pretty big disadvantages. Let's say that you have a population that has both asexual and sexual individuals in it. Okay, so let's say your asexual female can produce 4 offspring, and your sexual female can produce 4 offspring, but she needs a male to do it, right? And so by the second generation, even though a third of the population was asexual to start with, right? We have 2 sexual individuals and a asexual individual. So 2 out of the 3 are sexual. So we only have a third of the population that is asexual. Okay, does that make sense? And then by the second generation, though, if each of these females produces 4 offspring, right? Over here, 2 of them are male, okay? But by the second generation, half of the population is going to be asexual, okay? 4 and 4. And by only the third generation, with each of them producing 4 offspring, okay, the composition of population that is asexual, all right? Now we have 2/3, right? 2/3 of the population here is now asexual. All right, and then again, that's if you count the number of individuals that are sexual, 2, 4, 6, 8 versus 16 asexual individuals. So you can see that if we keep going here with more and more generations, and that's what this graph does down here. All right, so we have, a third of the population, half of the population, 2/3 of the population. By around the 9th or 10th generation here, 100% of the population is going to be asexual. All right, and so we would expect that asexually reproducing organisms would replace the sexually reproducing organisms in any sort of evolutionary battle, as it were. And so why would we have sex? Okay, and again, those benefits of recombination are often what are touted to be the biggest benefit of sexual reproduction, although, again, there are other kinds of benefits that people have talked about, especially with respect to protection from diseases. Another thing that can really impact life history strategies that you wouldn't really think about at first is just the relative size of the gametes between males and females when you have sexually reproducing species. Okay, so for some species like this green algae here, Chlamydomonas, the gametes are equal in size. Okay, and in many species, especially in animals such as mammals and other kinds of animal species, gametes are of different sizes, what we call anisogamy. Okay, and as you probably already are aware of, eggs are usually very much larger, 100 or 1,000 times larger than sperm. Here you can see a single egg cell that is trying to be fertilized by all of these different sperm here with their tails, and of course only one of them is going to make it. The first sperm in the egg will immediately develop a barrier to protect the other sperm from being able to get in, so that you have one egg and one sperm. But the fact that you have these huge size differences between sperm and eggs, interestingly, translates into consequences for mating strategies. Females have a lot more to protect, whereas males have a lot of relatively small, cheap sperm, okay? And that translates into females wanting to be very choosy about who they decide to mate with, and males increasing their likelihood of getting genes into the next generation by going around and mating with as many females as possible, okay? And this can set up these sexual conflicts. And there's actually a lot more to say about mating strategies, and I wish we had time in this class to talk more about that. because it's not always exactly the case for every species. That's kind of a more of a classic, conventional example, but it's not always the case for every species. And if you take my animal behavior course, which I'll probably teach in the spring of 2017, I hope, we'll talk a lot more about these different kinds of mating strategies that result from these unequal gamete sizes. So for now, just consider that sort of coming attractions and thinking about this vocabulary about isogamy and anisogamy. Many species actually have very complex life cycles. And because most vertebrates, including mammals, including ourselves, don't have these kinds of abrupt transitions between different stages as they grow, we tend to think that they're strange. But complex life cycles are actually more common than non-complex life cycles. In fact, by absolute numbers, they're the rule, not the exception. Okay, so this study showed that 25 out of 33 different animal phyla contain species with really complex life cycles, and 80% of species undergo metamorphosis. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about having different times in your life cycle where you have at least two distinct physiological, morphological stages that can differ in their habitat physiology or morphology. For example, and you're probably familiar with this, like butterflies undergo being a caterpillar that turns into a chrysalis that then eventually develops into the adult butterfly. Okay, or beetles have larvae that eventually develop into adults. Okay, so these are really different physiological, morphological stages, even though you're talking about the same individual here. Okay, and below here we have an adult sea star that started its life out as this planktonic larvae. Okay, so really, really different. And it's very interesting to think about what are the reasons for undergoing these abrupt transitions in life cycle. These abrupt transitions in form between stages is called metamorphosis, which you've probably heard before. And so when we ask the question, well, why undergo metamorphosis? Why undergo these abrupt transitions? Why be complex, right? One of the answers is that these different stages are subjected to different kinds of evolutionary selective pressures, okay? So the kinds of things that a larvae has to face can be very different than the kinds of things that adults have to face.